So we're picking up in chapter 30 with the perils or the threats of progress. President Johnson had warned in his inaugural address, "We have no promise from God that our greatness will endure." And Americans faced two dilemmas during this time period. And again, this was a time of great progress. The first dilemma was that this progress was often self-defeating. A lot of the consumer products that had been designed to make life better produced waste products that polluted the environment. And just an example of that is DDT. And this was a powerful chemical that was used to kill insects that were spreading diseases and destroying crops. But the side effect of DDT was that it also had lethal effects on birds and fish as well. And this is just one of many examples of the bad side effects of consumer products. So the first dilemma was that progress was self-defeating. The second one was that the modern industrial society placed a premium on social cooperation, but at the same time, it undermined the individual's sense of importance in society. And what I mean by that is that effective democracy was based on the fact that all voters be well informed, they be knowledgeable, they do their research, and many voters were those things, but almost everyone felt like their voices weren't even heard. Another example of this is that, for instance, exhaust fumes poison the air, but one single motorist who might inconvenience himself by keeping his car in a garage would have no effect on the general state of exhaust fumes in the air. It was almost like everything was too big to make a difference. And people tried to deal with these issues by joining organizations like AARP or the NAACP, but even these groups were large, and they were so large that people felt they weren't making a difference. President Johnson tried to build a consensus among Americans, but none really emerged. So what were the costs of prosperity? So the economy continually expanded during this time. Inflation went with it. There was an increase in inflation during this whole economic expansion. Technological advances created new products, new industries, and that was the cause of this economic expansion. Computers began to revolutionize business and production. People began to enter data into computers rather than writing it down by hand. Technology increased the capacity to support a larger population. On the other hand, the growing population strained the supply of resources. So prosperity came with a cost. So native-born ethnics. Mexican Americans had similar grievances in America to those of Black Americans. And in the 1960s, they began to organize and demand equal rights and equal access to the advantages of American society in the same way that the blacks had done. And like the Black movement, Chicanos, as it was called, stressed cultural pride, and they demanded citizenship rights. And also like the Black movement, they gave rise to nationalist and separatist groups. Now, not everyone in the Chicano movement was radical enough to want to form a separate state or to go somewhere else, but there certainly were groups that did say they should just totally desegregate themselves and go somewhere else and have a Chicano nation. The most influential Chicano leader was Cesar Chavez. And he concentrated on organizing migrant farm workers in California. Chavez was promoted by the American labor movement, and they were eager to enroll Hispanic members. His general approach to unionism was aggressive but nonviolent, and he made the farm workers' struggle a moral nationwide cause. So basically, he was the bargaining agent for about 50,000 field workers in California and Florida. Some Native Americans mobilized and called for red power or communist power, and a revival of Native American tribal customs. There was a group called AIM, which demanded the return of lands illegally taken from their ancestors. And similar movements took place as well, or a resurgence of cultural pride took place among Polish Americans, Italian Americans, and other groups like that. So after World War II, and especially after the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, progressive theories of education that stressed a child-centered approach and elective courses over traditional subjects came increasingly under attack. And the critics noted that the system that was in place produced poor work habits, fuzzy thinking, and just plain ignorance. And the person who led the attack on the school system was a guy named James B. Conant. And he was a former president of Harvard, and he published The American High School Today, which was a critical look at progressive education. He sold nearly 500,000 copies, and these were his complaints. He reprimanded schools for not teaching English, grammar, and composition effectively. He said that they were neglecting foreign languages, and they were ignoring the needs both of the brightest students and the dullest students. And there was an increasing demand for greater academic training and skills. So that demand, along with the baby boom, caused an explosion of enrollments at American colleges, universities, and junior colleges. Students in revolt. We've already talked about the fact that college students became extremely radical during the 1960s. And in general, they became less and less tolerant of the failure of government to regulate the economy in the general interests of the people and to protect the civil rights of all citizens. The persistence of racism and poverty in the richest country in the world seemed immoral, and they were speaking out against it. There were many students who spoke out against being hardline anti-communists, especially in the age of atomic weapons. They thought it seemed suicidal. And so this type of thinking drew students to the SDS, and this was the Students for Democratic Society. And they met together and set forth their goals and purpose in the Port Huron Statement of 1962. At Berkeley, there was some controversy over political organizing that gave rise to this free speech movement. There were several black students along with the SDS at Columbia that occupied university buildings in 1968. Blacks increasingly called for larger black enrollments, more black faculty, and black study courses. The counterculture was represented by the hippies. The hippies rejected the modern world. And I think we said in the last chapter they found refuge in hippie communes and crash pads, sometimes mystical religions, drugs. But their culture was opposite or counter to that of their parents of the 40s and 50s. Usually the counterculture was either apolitical or sometimes even anti-political. And then there were a group of yippies, with a Y, which combined elements of both, led by Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin. They were a radical, youth-oriented, and countercultural revolutionary offshoot of the free speech and the anti-war movements of the 60s. They were founded in 1967. So I don't know how these made it up here, but we've already talked about both of those. So we'll pick up with the sexual revolution. Traditional ideas about sexual behavior changed dramatically in the 1960s. There was more of an acceptance of sexual acts, the depiction of nudity in words or in pictures. And even though the majority of Americans didn't alter their beliefs or practices radically, their standards were no longer as accepted as the only valid standards. There were more efficient methods of birth control, i.e. the birth control pill or the pill, and antibiotics available that cured venereal diseases. And so this removed two of the impediments to sex outside of marriage. The Kinsey report revealed that many Americans engaged in sexual practices that society prescribed. So the sexual revolution reduced people's fears and opened up all kinds of doors for relations between the sexes. With that, it was accompanied by a rise in the number of illegitimate births and certainly an increase in the instances of sexually transmitted diseases. And with the sexual revolution and the sexual freedoms, and women's increasing role in the workforce, the experience of women in the civil rights movement and the New Left, all of this gave rise to demands by women for greater equality for themselves. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique signaled a revival of feminism in the United States, encouraging women to work outside of the home. Friedan and some other middle-class and professional women organized organizations like NOW, National Organization for Women. And there were even more radical groups than that. Younger, more radical women rejected NOW's hierarchical structure and its emphasis on lobbying and education. And these women employed different techniques, such as consciousness raising and demanding more radical changes in society, such as children being raised in communal centers. Some demanded the abolition of marriage altogether as a legal institution, and still others rejected heterosexuality. Kate Millett, who was one of the more radical feminists, published Sexual Politics, which attacked all the institution of patriarchy altogether. So the sexual revolution also encouraged the women's liberation movement. So we'll go ahead and conclude chapter 30, and we'll pick up with chapter 31 in the next video with Ford's presidency.